Hello and welcome to our conversation today with Commissioner Ylva Johansson, the Commissioner for Home Affairs, on the big issue of tackling the rise of cybercrime amid COVID-19. Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us. As a way of introduction, let me perhaps start with a few remarks. This is a joint conversation that we jointly conduct with the Financial Times, and Michael Peel, the chief diplomatic correspondent of the Financial Times, is here with us and will engage in the conversation as well. You, Commissioner, have been Commissioner since the beginning of this commission. Before, you've been Minister in Sweden, Social Democrat, and of course, a well-known figure in Brussels on many different topics. Now, the topic today is cybercrime, cybercriminals, fraudsters, organized crimes groups, and pedophiles are actually taking advantage of the coronavirus pandemic. There have been cyber attacks on the infrastructure, such as hospitals, online sales of fraudulent coronavirus tests and protection, and with so many children at home in front of devices, also child exploitation is increasing. You have been at the forefront of combating this kind of abuse. And perhaps as a start, we would like to hear from you, where do you see Europe's fight against cybercrime? And after that, we will have a free flowing conversation on many different topics, including many of the big legal challenges that we are seeing at the moment in Europe. Thank you so much again, Commissioner Johansson, for joining us. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this this seminar. And you just said that, of course, we can follow how the criminal patterns are changing, or how criminal groups are adapting very quick to the new situation. And what we have seen so far is that the traditional online criminal cybercrimes have been increasing, and also the classical cybercrime, used to say they are using malware, ransomware. You mentioned this hospital in Czech Republic, for example, that was a victim of that. But stealing identities, frauds, online radicalization, all these traditional cyber crimes are now increasing. But we also see new kind of criminal activities directly connected to the COVID situation, and that's where they exploit the fear of people, and the lack of equipment, and the needs that are huge all over the world, selling false materials or fake materials. And this is also something that Europol have been deeply involved in finding. There was a big asset of they tried to sell fake or false face masks that didn't exist, and we were able to, through a huge cooperation between different member states, to solve that, and that's important. And you also mention the demand for child sexual abuse that has been increasing a lot in many member states. But we can also see now that we are going into the deepest recession ever in Europe's and EU's history, not in Europe's, but in EU's history. So this is going to be a massive loss in GDP, and nobody really knows how big. There's been a massive loss in working hours, been a huge increase in unemployment, and of course this is also a new threat that is caused by this crisis, and this may also create new criminal activities, new criminal patterns. And I think that we have to be very aware of, for example, corruption, money laundering, but also terrorist radicalization, and how different groups can use this situation. I'm very afraid that somebody will be inspired by using biological weapons, for example, and seeing how big you can influence and lock down the whole world more or less with this kind of virus. So these are the patterns that we see, and I'm for sure we're going to go deeper into the response from the Commission. But just to mention a few things, I think it's important here. We have already planned to set up a security union strategy that we will present this summer, and my part of that will be fighting organized crimes, prevent terrorist attacks, and to make law enforcement fit for the digital age. And that has been very important even before, but now it's even more urgent to do that. So some of the things we are working on is how to make it the police cooperation closer, to facilitate that between different member states with maybe a police cooperation code or other ways to do it. Europol's possibility to cooperate directly with private companies and NGOs is another area we are looking into, and to improve the technical and legal exchange of criminal information like DNA, fingerprints. It's also a huge need to make improvements. But also I would like to mention the all people working in the law enforcement, especially police forces, but also others, have to be better trained. We can do that through CEPOL, but I think we could also look into, for example, could we have a special design Erasmus program for law enforcement to learn more from each other in this emerging new knowledge that it's very urgent, and it's we are lacking behind in the law enforcement according to the needs that we can see.
Michael, will you take the first question?
Yes, Commissioner, thank you very much for that introduction.
It's very low. Can we have it higher?
Commissioner, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, one point you mentioned, which really stood out, was you mentioned the pandemic had made people think about bioweapons. Now, clearly, bioweapons has been a major focus of some of the propaganda around the pandemic, the idea that this might be some kind of bioweapon somewhere. But do you have any evidence, any intelligence that actually there are criminal groups, state or non-state actors, that are already taking inspiration from the pandemic and looking at it as an idea that they can harness in the future?
No, we don't have that information, but I think this is an area where it's important to look closely and to follow, and it's very important to share information between police forces in different member states, and Europol is the hub for that exchange of information.
You mentioned the need to better cooperate more widely. You mentioned the German masks fraud, and what was very striking about that case was it had a Dutch angle, money ended up in British banks, there was an Irish middleman, so really a pan-European endeavour. I mean, clearly there's always been this friction between efforts to do more on an EU level and the fact that national security is a member state competence. Do you get the sense that perhaps member states are becoming a little more receptive to some of the ideas that you're talking about improving cooperation? In other words, they realize that the pandemic shows when a major challenge of this kind comes up, it actually pays to be a bit more flexible.
Yes, I have that impression. What's really have struck me since I took office here is that how eager member states are to cooperate closer in the area of security and law enforcement cooperation. This is really, it's quite a young area, you know, and the European Union, but member states trust each other and they would like to cooperate further. So this is something that we are looking into. I can't really give you the answers now, but we're looking into in which way we can cooperate closer and whether we need more of coordinated legislation as well, but also to facilitate and to make it easier for do this cooperation. So the answer to your question is yes. I really have this sense that member states would like to cooperate closer, but we also have to take into account the aspect of the European Parliament. So they are also part of a co-legislator if it comes to new kind of legislative proposals, of course.
You mentioned the appetite for greater cooperation, and yet in this very week we've had a ruling in Germany in the Constitutional Court which basically asserts primacy over an ECJ judgment. And isn't this something that actually completely undermines the idea of a common EU legal order and indeed the underpinning of the EU itself?
Well, we have to look further into that judgment before we take that kind of drastic solutions. I do not think that will be the outcome, actually. Of course, I would like to very much stress the primacy of EU law, and this is fundamental for the cooperation in the European Union. And of course, all member states and all national courts, the judgment European Court of Justice are binding for all national courts. This is a fundamental platform for the whole cooperation in the European Union. And of course, this has to be very strong. But may I also say for the fundamental for the cooperation, it's the law enforcement, it's the rule of law, it's the primacy of the EU law, but it's also values, the values that our European Union is based on. It's also the fundamental platform where all cooperation has to be built on. And I think that everybody realized that this is a prerequisite for a well-functioning European Union.
But yet, can I challenge you nevertheless on this point a bit further? I mean, the judgment coming out of Karlsruhe is clearly stating that the European Court of Justice has come out with an incomprehensible judgment, which I would say amounts to no less than a declaration of war against the European Court and also against the primacy of European law. And we have seen that in the wake of that decision and that pronouncement of the German court, already some forces in some countries have announced that they do not feel that they are as bound as before by European law and that the sovereignty is fully national. We've heard such pronouncement from Poland within 6 hours. So how worried should we really be about the integrity of the single law applicability in the European Union?
Well, I think, let me put it like this. We could, of course, never accept anything else than the primacy of EU law and that all national court has to follow the judgment of the European Court of Justice. But I also seen these comments from Poland, for example, and I think some of them are very quick to draw their conclusions. It's a quite long judgment, and let's look further into that before we draw these quick conclusions. But in my view, I don't think that it's possible to draw that kind of conclusions, because we really need, of course, this is the fundamental base of the cooperation in the European Union.
But Commissioner, why wouldn't it have the kind of impact that Gundrum has suggested there? I mean, it seems to be a direct contradiction, and how is it possible to get around that? Could you explain?
Well, let's come back to that after we have analyzed the judgments a bit further. So I don't want to go beyond that. Of course, there might be problems, but I think that some of those that have been very quick to declare the EU primacy, EU law primacy dead, have been acting a bit too quick.
I suppose if I could just ask one more question on this subject, that you mentioned values there, clearly, and you talked about common values. Well, of course, that's something that has been contested within the EU, and indeed the ECJ has been a major tool used by the Commission in cases to enforce what it sees as breaches of the rule of law. I mean, at the very least, whatever the full technical impact of this judgment, it has opened the door for people to make the kind of arguments that some countries such as Poland have tried to make. In other words, whatever the actual practical impact, it does really hit confidence, doesn't it? Especially as it's a court in the biggest member state and a country at the core of the EU project.
Yes, of course, and it's that's why I think it's you should not go that way and draw that conclusion, because that might be a very dangerous way to go forward for the cooperation.
Yes, and I have to say, if one adds the fact that the definition of what is proportional under the German court's ruling is a definition made by a German court, and therefore is a very particular interpretation of European law, is very uncomforting. And I could easily see other even Eurozone member states coming out with their own constitutional court, coming out with their own assessment of what would be proportional and asking their own central bank to do or not do things. So the integrity, it seems to me, of the single monetary union is here at stake, and I think it's actually quite a worrying development that we are seeing, and deserves a good answer. But I understand you you don't want to say more on that topic, so let me ask you a bit on the cooperation aspect that you just discussed. Can you say a bit more about the willingness of member states to cooperate in security matters, but then perhaps also on their willingness to build capacities in terms of data bases, data sharing, law enforcement capacities at the European level? Or do we remain in essentially a model where member states more or less voluntarily collaborate among each other?
No, I think that we will see member states more cooperating and collaborating even more. And I think this will increase, and there's a willingness to increase this kind of cooperation. But to make it a little bit more complicated, so when it comes to a lot of these issues, it also includes private companies or NGOs. Let's take this example of child sexual abuse, for example. The content is on these different kind of internet platforms. Many of the content has been sending through communication channels. Some of them now being encrypted. That means it's more difficult, even voluntary, for companies to detect this child sexual abuse content. We have this US organization NECMEC that receives 18 million child sexual abuse things that been reported to them every year, and now will the reports be so much when the encryption comes? Encryption could be very well good argument to encrypt communication for privacy reasons, but we also have to make sure that we do not make a safe space for pedophiles to share this content. So these are difficult issues to deal with, and how should private companies that find this content share it with authorities? Today they have to go through the US home security officials and then go into different member states. I'm looking into whether we should have a hub in Europe that could receive that kind of information and then distribute it to member states, for example. But all this cooperation with private companies, with NGOs, and also I should not say it's a contradiction, but it's a quite complicated area to both make sure that we have the privacy so that you can make sure that nobody else is using your identity or your information on a platform on one hand, but on the other hand, we would not like to have these closed closets for criminals or pedophiles to be have a safe area to share their content. So these are very difficult areas where I think that there's a political will to solve them, but they're not easy to solve.
Commissioner, you've talked about deficiencies in police training and about law enforcement authorities lagging behind. This is quite a common theme you've used. Could you give us a bit more detail on what you mean by that? I mean, what is it that police across the EU are not doing now that they need to do better?
Well, there's a lot of things, but you can imagine, I'm 56 years old. When I was a child, there was, policemen patrolling the streets. And they were looking after criminal activities, of course, but they also looked at everybody else. So they supervised us in the streets. And if there was, they could do a search in a home, a search for everything, if they had the decision to do so, and find a lot of things that could be linked to a criminal activity, but of course also a lot of other things that were innocent things. But now when almost everything has gone online, we have the same need to patrol and to search and to use the new technology, but that implicates a lot of more difficult concerns. Because it will interfere also with privacy. It will make the questions on how much data can be stored. But we all know that law enforcement need to store data, even this data that we do not know whether it's going to be used in an investigation later on or not. So I think that this is an area, it's about training for using technology, but it's also a way of learning and develop how can we also from the law enforcement use technology to make this balance, to make it a sound balance between privacy and efficiency for law enforcement. So these are areas where I think quite often I found that there is a clash between two important aspects, the law enforcement aspect and the privacy aspect. And both are, of course, very, very important. And I think that the lack of solutions, how we can mix them together, is the thing that I'm coming on almost every week, actually. And my impression is that law enforcement are often being the one who loses this crash. But of course, the other aspect also is very important as well. So I think this is an area to develop. Maybe new technology could be used. Maybe a new way of cooperation could be used. I don't know the answers yet, but this is an area that concerns me very much.
Could you give us one or two examples of specific examples of situations and activities where information is not being shared now because of privacy concerns, whereas you think it should be shared?
Well, an area is, I think that it would be good if we could share directly from private companies that find, for example, child sexual abuse content online directly to Europol, for example. I think that would be a good idea if that could be possible.
So one of the important areas of cybercrime is cybercrime in the financial world, in the financial sector, because the financial sector is, of course, extremely digital, and it's one of the most digital sectors we are having. And on top of it, we have a financial sector that is very tightly integrated in the European Union, and in particular in the Eurozone, where even supervision of banks, prudential supervision, is fully centralized in the European Central Bank. Yet, when it comes to cyber risk and cyber enforcement in that area, we essentially still remain in in a national approach, so that banks that are subject to a cyber attack have to notify primarily national security authorities and not European ones. Is it time in the financial system cyber area to actually centralize cyber enforcement and cyber information sharing much more quickly than perhaps in other areas, also because we are so much more tightly integrated?
Yeah, at least it's worth discussing it, I think. We just today, the Commission will launch a new action plan towards money laundering that will touch upon some of these issues. And I'm also preparing proposals when it comes to protecting critical infrastructure, and banking system is a critical infrastructure, for example. So there are many reasons why we should discuss and also make new proposals in this area, I think. And I think also that this corona crisis has shown us also how vulnerable our societies are, and it's how much we rely on some critical infrastructure, for example. And now when almost all payments has been online and digital, I mean, we never even use ordinary money anymore. And a lot of changes that was already going on has been much quicker now in this corona crisis. And I think that must also be one outcome must also be that we protect our societies better from risks and disturbance in these areas.
One theme, Commissioner, that people, security experts, have talked about is the impact that it's having on criminality, that people are at home using inferior security systems, often from what they would be using in their workplaces. I mean, have you seen a real spike from the intelligence you're seeing in crimes which are exploiting the inferior home security online setups that people have? And if so, can you give us a little bit of detail of what you're seeing?
Oh, what we have seen is what I started to say with this using the fear and using also the traditional malware and stealing of identities and credit cards and so on. But I must also say what we learned from the reports from Europol is that it's very difficult to draw any conclusions yet. I think we should be hesitating to draw conclusions. We can see some trends, we can see some risks, but it's not that obvious that we can say that this is a totally new pattern, or we can draw any big conclusions out of that yet.
One area you've spoken about.
Michael, we are receiving questions, and perhaps I can ask one or two questions from the audience in between our conversation, to also give an audience, our online audience, of the floor. So we have a question by a person called Elle, and she asked the question: is it about training existing law enforcement, or is it actually about creating a whole new cyber police force whose specialism are entirely different on top of traditional police forces? Is training enough, or do we need something very different?
Well, the answer is we need to do both. I do think that we need special trained forces for some of these cybercrimes. But at the same time, 85% of all criminal cases includes electronic evidence today. So almost in all ordinary criminal cases, you need to have the knowledge how to deal with online evidence, for example. So the answer is both.
Commissioner, I wondered if I could follow up on a question about cross-border cooperation in the financial sector, which Guntram raised a few minutes ago. You've spoken before about asset recovery and how such a tiny proportion of criminal assets is estimated to actually be frozen or seized. Can you talk us through a bit about why that is proving so difficult? In other words, why hasn't asset recovery sort of caught up with the kind of frictionless idea of the single market in legitimate goods? And tell us a bit about what you're doing to improve this situation.
Well, to be honest, I can't really answer you why, but we are looking into what could be reasons, and that's also, of course, leading to what could be answers from a European level for new initiatives, but we're not really there yet. So we have this asset recovery offices in all member states. Are they strong enough? What do they need else to be better prepared to act? This is a question we are looking into. We can see, do we need more of harmonized legislation? We have a directive, is it strong enough, or is it something else that is missing that we need to look into? But I'm ready to look into whether we need to if needed, to have a stronger also European legislation in this area. To be honest, I do not have the answer to your question. So that's why we are looking into this area, because I can't really accept that only 1% as being confiscated. This is really, really a low percentage. And I think also that when it comes to security issues, it's important to have the faith and the trust from the ordinary citizens. And they, of course, if they would have to apply to a lot of regulations and control, maybe supervising what they do on internet or whatever, they also ask, what do you do? Do you really get these bad guys and the organized criminals? Can you get the money back, or are we just feeding them all the way with our money? So I think it's also important for the trust in the whole security system that we can show that we can have a higher percentage of assets.
So we have a question from a person called Eric, who asked about websites where child pornography is distributed by users themselves and the website doesn't intervene. So how do you deal with websites where the content is not on the website but actually streamed from individuals that use it? Is that a particular problem you are looking into?
Well, the situation, thank you for your question, Eric. And the situation is that it's impossible for the law enforcement to search the whole internet all the time and all the communication for this kind of terrible content. So we rely on the willingness for private companies to actually deliver and to search by themselves voluntarily for these criminal activities and criminal films and pictures online, and deliver that towards the law enforcement. And this is a very important hub for that is the US organization NECMEC that receives a lot of these information, and they send it to the US authorities. The US authorities send it to national authorities in Europe, and then we can go further on with investigations. So I think that for me, it's important that this kind of information we have right now, I would like it to go quicker. That might need a new regulation that we can send information quicker. I'm afraid of that information will be hidden behind encryption and can't be found anymore. A lot of those that's been sent now to the NECMEC in US are from Messenger. And if Messenger are going to go into encryption, will be the situation, maybe very less content, that will be fine. So it's not an easy way to regulate, but right now I'm also a little bit afraid that we are being losing information that we have right now under the that more and more information is being encrypted. So this is, of course, a very difficult area to regulate. We need regulation, but it's also quite complicated to do this regulation, especially as it is all over the globe, actually. So well, I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's part of this, as I said, about the competence to deal with in the digital world, where it's not really one single solution. If you do this, then we have solved the problem. Unfortunately not. So we have to deal with a lot of difficult issues here. And for me, it's very important also that have the public debate that make people aware of those risks, because we see a lot we can benefit a lot from all these online activities and a lot of communication that we really like it. You know, it's a lot of good things in there, but it's also my role a bit to raise a finger and say, well, hey, there's also a dark side of this, and we have to protect, at least we have to protect children.
You talked, Commissioner, to any of the tech companies about this, and if so, what has their reaction been?
Yes, I have, and we also have a special forum for this. So we have this regular dialogue with them. But I think also that we need maybe to go further into to look into also technical solutions that might be possible to develop together with these private companies, how to detect in a good way. So we find this balance between privacy and encryption and using technology in a way to find this content. And this is an area I would like to develop further together with the private companies.
Do they think that might be technically possible?
Yes, that's what they say to me.
So we have another question by Nico Kappens, who wonders whether you think that the threat is coming from countries or from individual initiatives. And I think that probably relates to our discussion. You mentioned bioterrorism, but you also mentioned, of course, cyber attacks. Where do you see the main risks for the EU? Do they come from individuals sitting somewhere in a basement, hackers in a basement, or do they come from actually governments or quasi-governments?
Thank you for your question, Nico. It's a very good question. And unfortunately, the answer is both. We see high risks coming from both from countries and from organized criminals, as well as individual and radicalized individuals, for example. So we have to deal with both. In my portfolio, I basically deal with the criminal groups and the radicalized individuals. But unfortunately, we have to be aware for the both kind of threats.
If I could just follow up on that, Commissioner, have you seen an increase in cyber attacks from state actors during the pandemic? And if so, can you give us a bit of detail about which countries these are coming from and what is the nature of these attacks?
This is nothing that's been reported by Europol.
I wonder if I could turn to a question about the impact of Brexit. Clearly, there's been quite a wide assumption, or at least there was, that security cooperation ought to be something in which both the EU and the UK had a very strong interest in doing a deal, very much something that's mutually beneficial. I wondered, though, if you were concerned about the way things were going for two reasons. Number one, the specific arguments about UK access to databases and the difficulty that they will have in accessing some of them potentially. Europol is an obvious example. The PRUM database obviously is another, with DNA samples and so on it. But also the bigger political question, which is that negotiations in the broader sense don't seem to be going very well at all. And in that scenario, is there a danger that security cooperation could be collateral damage, and that we could end up with a rather disastrous situation where there are no agreements in place at all by the end of the year, and that's something that could potentially be very damaging to both sides and allow cross-border criminality to flourish?
No, I'm not worried about that. I'm quite convinced that we will find a solution to this. There is a very strong will from both sides, both from the UK and from the EU, to find this way forward. And we will both benefit from a cooperation in the security area. And politically, I don't think it's so difficult. I mean, for us from the EU side, it's important that the UK follows GDPR and data protection rules and things like that, and I think they will. So then it will be possible to continue. Of course, we need to find some new ways to do that, but it's not. This is not something that keeps me awake at night, actually.
So since we are on the topic of Brexit, there is actually one question in the audience also by Laurent Bono, who asks the following question: the Straits of Dover will soon be the busiest EU external border, with lots of people and trade, of course, happening. How do you ensure its efficient management post-Brexit?
Thank you, Laurent. This is a really good question. And borders, this is one of the more difficult issues in the Brexit negotiations, how we should deal with the borders. And of course, it's the most pressing thing is for Ireland, but will also be for Dover, for example. And a very critical thing is whether we will have what will be the outcome of the negotiations when it comes to the common market, for example. And this is a political, very difficult issue where the EU and UK initially are standing quite far away from each other. And an important thing for access to the single market is, of course, that you have you realize or recognize the primacy of EU law and European Court of Justice. We just talked about that. So this is a politically more complicated area. And if we can't solve that, then of course it will be very high and very difficult at the borders. We have seen what the problems with closed borders, with the restrictions that member states put now in the COVID situation, that causes a lot of queues and other problems, and I worked very hard to solve them. And of course, with a Brexit that do not solve this border things and the custom units and the single markets, of course, that could be a very, very difficult situation. So let's hope that we can find a good way forward together with the UK on this issue. But in my perspective, this is a more complicated one than the security.
Another aspect of that border question, Commissioner, is agreements on migration. And are you confident that it will be possible to get an agreement with the UK on returns, for example, to the European Union from the UK?
What? I don't really follow you. Returns of
nationals. So in other words, by ceasing to be a member of the EU and becoming a third country, totally different migration arrangements will now apply. How can you give us a sense of how those discussions are going, and whether this is something you're concerned about?
No, this is not really part of the negotiations, and I don't foresee that there will be any big problems for returns. We are returning nationals. Well, of course, UK will take back their own nationals, and this is not an issue. So no, I don't think that we will have problems in this area.
So I have a question from perhaps moving on from Brexit, again more narrowly on, or more precisely on the cyber issue by Alexander. And he asked the question: To tackle cybercrime, it is crucial to bridge the gap between law enforcement, which acts by nature ex post, and intelligence, which can act ex ante. What is your plan to bridge that gap?
Thank you, Alexander, and you are totally right. Intelligence is not part of EU competence. So this is not part of my portfolio, and I can't act there. Member states can cooperate in this area, but it's not a competence for the European Union.
I wonder, just to dodge back just one more point about Brexit, Commissioner, and then we really can move on. But what about extradition? I mean, this is clearly something that has already cropped up. There are some countries like Germany and Austria which have constitutional bars on extradition to third countries and without an agreement. How can you give us a sense of how those negotiations are going? I mean, are you confident that there will be an extradition arrangement in place with the UK by the end of the year that will allow law enforcement authorities with legitimate cases in both directions to pursue people on the other side?
Well, I'm sorry, I really can't answer you on this. This is the competence in the portfolio of my colleague Didier Reinders, and I'm not really updated on it. So sorry, I'm not the right person to answer that right now.
So I think we are coming close to the end of our conversation. Perhaps to close off, I mean, there is one question, and perhaps we can put it a bit wider. The question is about the Commission's recovery plan and the digital aspects of the recovery plan. I guess you are not, it's not primarily your portfolio, but we would still love to hear where do you see the main investments in the cyber infrastructure to be happening also in this recovery phase that we will have to see in the next years? I mean, is there a readiness in the EU budget to shuffle significant amounts of money into build up of security, cybersecurity infrastructure at this moment?
Of course, this is the Executive Vice President, Margrethe Vestager's portfolio, and to put forward the whole digital reforms. But I can answer so far that it will be part of the recovery plan. And I think it's extremely important that we use this. I mean, I just talked about this. We are into the biggest recession in EU history. And we need, of course, to make a lot of investments and efforts to make our economy growing again. And we can't afford to let this opportunity go out to also, at the same time, invest in the Green Deal and the digitalization. I think it would be a huge mistake if we try to invest in the old economy. We have to invest even quicker into the new economy. And that's part of that Green Deal, and the digitalization is the most prioritized things for this Commission, and it will be also very visible in the recovery plan.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Johansson. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions, but also thank you to our listeners who have engaged with us. And thank you, Commissioner, for answering also so many questions from our listeners. It was a great pleasure and honor to host you in these difficult times. Thank you for making yourself available for this call, and bye-bye. Thank you to all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.